Thanks for having me along for this little wellness week. This is a really important topic, I think, the topic I'll be talking about, which is immunity, especially in light of what's going on globally at the moment, the global pandemic. And it's really interesting that when the pandemic first started hitting, there was almost a polarity in opinions. You had a lot of people on, what we might consider the alternative fringe, saying that there were a whole bunch of nutrients or diets or all sorts of things that could cure COVID. And on the other hand, we have the orthodox medical community probably quite rightly saying, well, there's no cure for COVID. But also within that, dismissing the role of diet and nutrients and lifestyle. Then you had within the middle ground, a lot of researchers, practitioners like myself, who were very vocal about saying, well, if we're using this as almost a cautionary tale now of what we can do both now and in the future, we need to be more aware of health. We need to be more aware of the role that overall health and the facets of health have to play in immunity and have to play in our resilience and our resistance to infection. Now, because of that, a lot of us were sort of shouted down a little bit in the early days because people were then saying, well, you're promoting cures for COVID. And my response was, that's specifically not what we're saying. We're not saying that anything will cure COVID or any other illness. What we're saying is that for us to be as healthy as we can be and to have properly functioning immune systems is going to place us in the best position to be more resistant to infection. And even apart from that, just to live the best life that we can. Now, we base this on some certain fundamental truths. There are scientific truths that we know. We know that within the modern food environment, within the modern Western style diet, and this translates across all the sort of modern developed nations, New Zealand, Australia, the US, Canada, the UK, we know that there are a lot of people who are insufficient in at least one or more of the essential vitamins and minerals. And some of those key essential vitamins and minerals being things like preformed vitamin A, zinc, magnesium, vitamin D, and some of the B vitamins. Now, those are also some of the key cofactors for proper immune function. So really what we're getting at within the discussion around diet and nutrition and indeed lifestyle for immunity is we're not talking about boosting immunity. We're not talking about curing anything. What we're talking about is being replete, providing the things that we need in order to function correctly. So it's really about having the building blocks that we require to properly modulate our immune system, to properly modulate our responses, and therefore to be as healthy as we can be. What we've more recently seen in the emerging research is that we're beginning to see now the provings of this in relation to our specific problem right now, in relation to COVID. We're beginning to see data coming out showing that countries with poor selenium status have typically done worse. We've had some really interesting randomized controlled trials start to emerge showing the role of vitamin D in really inhibiting the severity of this illness and drastically reducing mortality. So now we're beginning to see the specific provings, but again, it's not about curing. It's just about having the building blocks that we require to function correctly. So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll run through a little prezzo on immunity. So hopefully you can all see that now. Give me a nod.
We can see it.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Okay, so we're talking about the role of supporting immunity here in order to be at our best and to be in our best level of health and function to basically be more resilient in the face of all of life's challenges, whatever they happen to be. So the immune system is basically the body's defense system. It protects us against pathogens like viruses, like fungi, like bacteria, protozoa, and also helps with cleaning up and remodeling tissue in the event of injury. So it's critically important. And we need to understand that pathogens, whether they be viruses, or particularly viruses, mutate very rapidly. And so we need to have both specific and non-specific defenses and defenses that can also rapidly evolve along with the pathogens that we're exposed to. And it starts with the first line of defense being innate immunity. And this is basically just the immunity that we are more or less born with. This is non-specific, and this targets any non-self tissue that arises. And we basically we'll use that to target anything immediately upon recognition. Then we have adaptive immunity, which is the longer term evolving immunity. So this is in response to specific pathogens. So for example, in light of the current situation, we will develop antibodies and immune responses against COVID specifically, or against the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID. And that will last for some time. Now, different pathogens and our responses to them, our adaptive responses to them will be quite different as well. So for some things, we can have near lifelong immunity. For some things, we'll have lifelong immunity, but for others, we'll have very long-term immunity. For a virus like the flu, it tends to rapidly mutate, and so we don't always have long-term immunity to it, but we will have some lasting and crossover immunity. Similarly with SARS-CoV-2, we don't know exactly how long our immunity would last to it, but it's likely to be, in the range of 4 months plus. But again, we need to sort of see what that will actually turn out to be in the research. But the immune system itself is made up of a whole range of cells that recognize pathogens, differentiate them from self-tissue, which is really important. And in the case of autoimmunity, that's not always working correctly. So if, for example, someone has an autoimmune condition, they will recognize self-tissue as an invader and attack it. Now, this is typically, I'm going a little bit tangential here, but this is important. This is really interesting stuff because traditionally this has been thought of as just being a hyperactive or overactive immune response. And I would posit that that's not really correct because we know that we have various changes in how an autoimmune condition will function. We can see that with, again, nutrient repletion, with changes in diet, with changes in lifestyle, with reductions in stress, people will be less prone to relapsing with autoimmune conditions. So it's not simply that there's an overactive immune response, it's that there's not a properly modulated immune response. And this then crosses over into how we see all types of infections and illnesses, because it's usually about the modulation of that. And what's helping to modulate our immune responses? Well, a big part of it is having the correct building blocks for immune function. And so the research tells us some interesting things about nutrients. There's certainly a lot of evidence to show that, for example, having sufficient levels of omega-3 fats, which you might get from fish if you're not vegan, or you might get from an algal supplement, or from base omega-3s like the ones we get from flaxseed oil if you're vegan or vegetarian. And there are a range of vitamins and minerals that are also critically important for immune function. Key amongst those, I'd say, would probably be vitamin A, C, E, D, and zinc. Now, all the nutrients are really important, but these are the ones that are real critical cofactors for immune function. And they're also often, particularly when we talk about vitamin D, zinc, and to some degree vitamin A, these are often the nutrients that are less sufficient in the modern food environment. We know, for example, from New Zealand government data, which pretty much mimics US government data, that about 45% of men and 25% overall are deficient or insufficient, I should say, in zinc. A large proportion of people are not necessarily sufficient in vitamin D, and that also varies on a case-by-case basis. A big part of my work nowadays is to publish case studies on specific interesting cases, because what we can often see is that one person's sufficiency is not another's. And if we have an underlying health condition, for example, that might be affecting our ability to use certain nutrients. Or in some cases, there might be an association between that health condition and certain genetic polymorphisms, we call them, or genetic dysfunctions, let's say, that change our ability to either absorb, transport, utilize, or metabolize various nutrients too. So really, we come back to the same position that nutrient repletion is a critically important thing. But there are also some other components of diet that also have some pretty good evidence that they can help to modulate immune function and help to make us more resilient. These are things like bioflavonoids that we get from various plant foods. So, we can already have a take-home message there, eat more plant foods. Various adaptogenic herbs, medicinal mushrooms have been used traditionally as immune supporting foods. And now there's a lot of research that's going into helping to support that as well in the modern sort of Western scientific sense. Even common culinary herbs like rosemary, sage, thyme, the mints, they're incredibly nutrient dense foods, and they can also help to support immune function as well. And one of the things that has potentially happened to the Western diet over, say, the last 50 to 100 years is we tend to have a lot of flavors that aren't necessarily built on the original food. So you might have a sage flavor or a rosemary flavor, but it's not necessarily that plant. And so it doesn't contain all those various health supporting chemicals that are in the original plant. You know, spices such as turmeric, they're also very important, or not very important necessarily, but very useful for supporting immune function. Probiotics, synbiotics, which are combinations of pre, pro, and postbiotics, and some other more novel foods like spirulina and chlorella have some very interesting evidence that they can help to support and even in some cases mildly boost the immune system, which can help us to respond better to threats, particularly from viral pathogens. So there's a lot going on there, but really when we look across the spread of all the things that might help, we begin to see an ever expanding compendium of foods, right? And it sort of takes us back to the idea that we don't just want to target any one specific nutrient. We want to eat a diet that's more nutrient dense. We want to be taking in more of those things that help to really support health, but by proxy, we're going to be supporting immune function. And then in a circuitous way, also supporting health again. So of course, as I originally mentioned, you know, we're not talking about curing anything here. We're not talking about boosting the immune system to some crazy level, because that could in fact be harmful. You know, if we simply boost the immune system, then we can be talking about a situation of a hyperimmune response, which can be really dangerous. We're not talking about that. We're talking about having the building blocks to properly modulate the immune system, have it working fantastically. But outside of nutrition and outside of nutrients and outside of various aspects of diet, there are other things we can also do. And the role of lifestyle has been pretty well studied in respect to immunity and is also critically important. So we know, for example, that exercise helps to boost immunity or helps to support immunity. When we're more resilient through building our tolerance to work, to physical work, we're also far more able to be more resistant to these viral pathogens and other pathogens. But we want to be aware of not exercising too much. One of the things that can suppress the immune system is to overdo your own work tolerance. And so I think one of the things we really need to focus on is building towards. You know, we often start with exercise like a bull at a gate. You know, we rush like a bull at a gate trying to get as much exercise as we can within a short period of time. But that can actually be such a high stress event, it can basically collapse our immune system for a little while. And then we're more prone to infections. We see this a lot in hard training athletes. They're always often on the cusp of having a little cold. So we really want to build our tolerance to work over time. So if you are exercising now, that's fantastic. If you're not, the idea is to start with something you can do and do it every day. Let's say we start with going for a walk. Go for a quick walk around the block. Maybe that's it for the first day. Each day, try and add just a little bit and not to the point of fatigue. Over time, we're basically training our body, almost tricking our body into having a higher work tolerance and work threshold. Eventually, we want to get to a point where we're doing at least, say, a couple of resistance training sessions a week, whether that be in the gym or maybe doing a more intense sort of form of yoga, doing a little bit of higher intensity cardio work, and then also having the bookmark almost of doing a lot more residual movement. And so I'm a really big fan of getting in 7,500 steps a day. I know people say 10,000, but the tipping point for health seems to actually be a little bit lower than that. And it's a lot more achievable for people, but also interspersing that with some resistance work. So I know I'm going a little bit tangential again here, but one thing that I've had a lot of success with, particularly for people who are very fatigued or are just getting into exercise, is to start with, you know, just going for a walk and building to 7,500 steps, but also beginning to do just some resistance work each and every day. Now that might be a set of push-ups and a set of body weight squats every day. If you start with one push-up and one squat, that's fine, because you can build the next day to 2, the next day to 3. And in fact, I did this after suffering some pretty severe back injuries through weightlifting. I used to be a competitive weightlifter, and I got to the point where I was so debilitated and immobilized, you know, having been a world record holding weightlifter, lifting things that had never been lifted before, I could only do literally one squat and one push-up. but that was okay because I started from the basics again, built up, adding one of each every day until I was able to get back and return to some sort of form of competition and being the awesome dude I am now. You don't need to agree with that last statement either. That's completely optional. Stress is also a really massive impactor of immunity. And this is probably one of the, if not the biggest lifestyle factor that affects immunity. And really, when we're talking about stress, again, we're talking about how we respond to stress, not just having stressors. So the amount of stress overall that we have is going to play a big role, but how we recover from that is going to be critically important. And the other factors that I'm talking about, like nutrition, like exercise, like sleep, and other things like mindfulness, help us to respond and adapt to stress. But probably of critical importance, I think, is the emerging research really shows quite strongly that our effort to reward balance is the key aspect of stress. So often we think, well, if I'm working more, for example, I'm going to be more stressed and my immunity is going to suffer. But that's not always the case, because if you're doing more work and you're doing something you love and you're being really well rewarded for it, it doesn't really have that much of an impact. The biggest impact is when A, you can't recover from the work you're doing, or B, you're not being rewarded. And rewarded isn't necessarily a financial thing either. It's being appreciated, being respected. Sure, there might be some financial or monetary reward associated with certain things, but it's more the feeling you get from having done the work. And so where we have a lot of stress, that's a really interesting avenue to explore for ourselves is, am I really being rewarded for this? And how does that work for me? You know, is it just because of someone else, or is it because of my relationship with what I'm doing? Is it because of my relationship with the perceived rewards I get? So really that's just being thrown out there as something that we can use as a bit of a check-in for ourselves. If we are feeling really stressed, you know, is that effort to reward ratio there? Because that is one of the most critical things, and not just for stress, but directly translated to how our health and immunity function in response to stress as well. Just as an FYI, I've also sent through a little ebook to Haley as well, which is going to send out to you guys, which has got all of this in depth too. Now, the other aspect of lifestyle, of course, which is really important for immunity and for health overall, is sleep. This is something that's been a real sort of passion project of mine over the last year or so. I've done some big reviews on sleep and the interrelationship it has with everything else. And it's really fascinating when we look at all of these health topics, how bidirectional they are. You know, gut health affects sleep. Sleep affects gut health. Sleep affects how much we choose to eat, how much we crave sugar. Those things also affect our sleep, which affects our stress. And stress obviously stops us from sleeping. And it's this big web that we weave. But sleep itself has an enormous effect on health. And it's also affected by health. So if we're in poor health, we sleep more poorly. When we sleep more poorly, we're in poorer health. And that can be either sleeping too little, sleeping too much, and particularly, and probably most importantly, the quality of sleep. So there are certainly some things we can do to improve our sleep. And I think most of us know what those are. You know, to get off our phones later at night, to maybe not be exposed to so much aggressive media and aggressive advertising, to maybe be streaming shows rather than watching network television that has a lot of evocative advertising and things like that. But obviously also, like I mentioned, those other things we're doing for health, exercising, eating well, meditating, are all going to translate into greater sleep or better sleep as well. So we're going to look a little bit into some of the specific things we can do. And I know these are probably, they seem a little bit simple, but simple is usually the key. You know, I like to get into the complexities of the human body because I'm a researcher and that's what I do. But at the end of the day, often having looked at the complexities, we need to take it back to some very simple things that we can do to actually apply what we can see in the research. So one of the key things we can do to help support immunity is to eat enough. Now, this is an interesting thing because a lot of times in the modern world, we think about, well, we eat too much, right? Because we have a growing diabetes epidemic, or that diabetes/obesity epidemic. But there are a significant amount of people, and we suspect around 20%, I'm actually involved in some research looking at this now, of people who don't eat enough. They're underfueled. And if you're underfueled, your body goes into a stress response to basically free up fuel internally. you lower your metabolic rate, you're also in a stress response, you're freeing up fuel. And that can be quite detrimental to the immune system. And we've actually seen this quite vividly in our early case research, is that under eating has a big role to play in not having optimized immune responses. Now, of course, when we talk about eating enough, we also do need to recognize that metabolic syndrome, diabetes, being with overweight or obesity also have a big effect on immune function. But to some degree, it's not that people are simply overeating too much of the good stuff. It's generally that our food environment is conducive to overeating foods that are high in energy and low in nutrient density. So to some degree, eating enough, but of the right things, translates across whether you're a habitual undereater or habitual overeater. So we really want to make sure that we're eating enough of the right stuff. A big part of that, of course, is to eat 6 or more servings of vegetables per day. And I think this is probably one of the big things that maybe most of us aren't doing enough of. And I know there is a bit of a movement recently in some sectors actually against eating vegetables. And I think that's a little bit naive, because every bit of research we see shows that the more vegetables we eat, the more likely it is that we have a nutrient sufficient diet. And directly translated to outcomes, generally the more vegetables you eat, the longer you're going to live and the better your health is going to be within that time that you're on the planet. So that should be a real priority. And I always think that people should try and eat at least 2 or 3 fist-sized servings of vegetables at each meal. And to also base those meals on protein. So having at least, say, 1 palm-sized serving of protein at each meal. And that's because protein is so critical for helping us modulate how much we eat. When we eat sufficient protein, we're less likely to crave sugar. We're less likely to crave all other things, actually. We eat a better quality diet overall. But there are also certain amino acids, particularly glutamine, that's provided by a protein-sufficient diet that has a direct link to immunity. So that's particularly true for athletes and high-performing individuals, corporates, people who are highly stressed. They require a bit more glutamine to have optimized immune function. And so we can supply that not by supplementing glutamine, but just by eating enough high quality protein. And so that's why I often think that for a lot of people, it's, a good idea to supplement if you're unsure. I certainly do this because I know if I'm not having a protein shake after training every day, it's not that a protein shake's magical. It's just that if I don't have it after my training session, I consistently undereat protein by about that much. So the easiest thing for me to do is just to add in a protein shake, and that means I get that protein sufficiency each and every day. Of course, I need to disclose my interest in Newzest here. I'm one of the formulators for the product, but obviously because I formulated it, I know it's good stuff. And I'm also a big fan of supplementing with a quality multi or a multi-enriched food of some sort. And that's just basically because when we look at the data, while we can get what we require from food, the reality is a lot of people aren't. And we think typically that it's the people who are eating a really poor diet who are not getting enough of what they require. But it's not always the case either. If someone is under a lot of stress, if maybe other lifestyle factors aren't in play as much as they should be, if they're an athlete, if they're a high-performing individual who, again, is under a lot of pressure, let's say work pressure, it can be harder to get all of the various nutrients that they require. And so a multi really helps just to fill in those gaps. It acts like nutritional insurance for the diet. Of course, as I mentioned, we want to exercise, but not too much, and to use those strategies I mentioned before to sort of build up over time, create that resilience, increase that work threshold. And then along with that, to make sure we allow ourselves the proper recovery time to both recover from the stressors of the day, to recover from our exercise, to help the brain clear out all the toxic waste that's created by the metabolic activity. And you can only do that at night. So to get 8 hours or so, for some people it's a little bit less, some people a little bit more, but to get around 8 hours of restful sleep per night is really critically key. And it's, like I say, one of the things that I think is probably most lacking for a lot of people nowadays. And to reduce your life stress, or to at least modify your responses to your life stress. And one of the ways that we can really help with that is to meditate. Now, again, this is something that is completely optional, but it's an interesting one because often when I talk to my clients, I'll say, well, do you meditate? And the typical response is, no, but I know I should. And I'm a big fan. I wrote about this in a couple of my books, just getting rid of the word should, right? There's no should. You're either going to do it or you're not. So we get to that point of saying, well, why would you want to meditate? Well, I want to be calmer and more relaxed, and I want to reduce stress and all these various things. Okay, cool. Well, now we've seen what benefits might occur for you. Are you going to do it? And they typically say, well, yeah, I'd love to, but I don't really have the time. So I say, well, have you got 1 minute tomorrow morning? I got 1 minute. 1 minute's easy, right? What kind of question is that? We'll start with 1 minute. Start with 1 minute tomorrow, and the next day do 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, build up over 10 days to doing 10 minutes of meditation. And then don't go past that for a while. Just do 10 minutes of meditation each morning for at least 30 days to build the habit of health. And that way we can start to really, again, build into these ways of being that help to improve our health, improve our immunity. And we do it in a very easy way that's almost kind of like the exercise analogy. It's almost tricking the body into being healthier and into habits of health. So I hope the take-home message today has been that a healthy, well-functioning immune system is really a function of having a healthy, well-balanced life. It's about building the habits of health through exercise, sleep, mindfulness, and good nutrition that help to support immunity. It's not about boosting or having any sort of curative stuff. It's about being more resilient and building the habits that allow that resilience. So team, that was me. I'm Cliff Harvey. I'm a nutritionist and researcher from down in New Zealand. I'm associated with Johnny up at NewZest USA, and you can find out a bit more about him and the products at newzestusa.com, a little bit more about me at cliffharvey.com, and the college I run is the Holistic Performance Institute. So that's me. I'm going to stop the share now, and if we do have a couple of minutes, I'm happy to take any questions from you guys. Or if you couldn't understand what I was saying, that's fine as well. I've got a pretty thick accent.
I had a quick question. Is there any risk in having like too many vitamins if you have like a multivitamin every day and then like a bunch of vegetables and fruit or something? Like, does that affect anything?
Generally not, but because there are typically restrictions on how much can be added to multis, they're generally pretty safe. So if you're taking a multi and eating a good diet, it's very unlikely that you'll take in too much. Now, if you have an underlying health condition that might cause you to store an excess of a certain mineral or something, then there is a possibility there. But I'd say anyone with a health condition should probably just check in with a dietitian or nutritionist or their doctor just to make sure what they're taking is appropriate. But for most people, taking a broad general multi in addition to a diet is generally very safe. Where people can run into some problems is if they're taking specific high dose, like single vitamins or single minerals. For example, taking a high dose iron supplement, if you're not iron deficient, can be very problematic. Taking a high dose zinc supplement, if you're not insufficient in zinc, can also be problematic. So that's where I think the caution should really be, is in taking the single high dose stuff.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Great question.